In Matthew 16, Jesus chastised the Pharisees who could interpret the appearance of the sky but failed to interpret the signs of the time in which they lived. Who are the Pharisees of our day?
This strong hold of sort of whiteness and white identity and pristineness is really part of what keeps us from making progress.
We need to do better. The church, rich in theological scholarship, has lingered in academic sanctuaries and ivory towers, failing to translate its lofty doctrines into a tangible and practical cultural apologetic. At the Worldview Youth Academy, we bridge this critical gap. Here, theological depth is not an end in itself, but a means to engage with contemporary cultural issues for the glory of God and the expansion of His kingdom. Our mission is to cultivate thinkers who can articulate and apply Christian truths within contemporary societal challenges. So embrace this call to worship God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your mind. We will do better as this next generation tears down the idols of our modern culture and works to build a brighter future toward Christendom 2.0. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the podcast for Cultural Reformation, brought to you by the Ezra Institute. I'm Dr. Joe Boot. I'm the founder and president of the Ezra Institute, and it's good to be back with you today. Ezra is a worldview and cultural apologetics think tank and training organization, and our mission and our concern is to advance the lordship of Jesus Christ, the truth, freedom, and beauty of the gospel to every corner of creation. I am back this week with a special guest, and we are going to get into our topic in just a moment with one of our dear friends of the ministry and a fellow of the Ezra Institute. He is our fellow for international law and comparative politics and international relations. So Dan Ogden is a lawyer. He's an expert in the constitutional law of the United States, and somebody who's lectured for us and spoken on political issues and legal issues, and we're delighted to have him back. So Dan, welcome. We'll be back to you in just a moment. I just want to remind all of you, as we draw now into the summer months, that very soon we have our first Worldview Youth Academy happening in the United States, in Gatlinburg. And there is just a week or so left for you to sign up if you are not yet registered and you want to come to that. That's for 14 through 18-year-olds. It's our Worldview Youth Academy. It's our first one. There's a few spots left. It's our first one in the United States. That's happening in July. And then, of course, if you're in Canada, the Worldview Youth Academy is happening in August. We've got a tiny bit of space there left as well. So if you're interested in that, go to our website, www.ezrainstitute.com, and sign up for those programs. And you won't be disappointed. You won't regret it. So our subject for today is a bit of a break from our current series. We're in the midst of a series, Conversations and Presuppositions, and we've been looking at a variety of subjects over the last few weeks. Last week, we looked at the question, the conversation starter, if you will, is Christianity anti-democratic? And if you'd missed that show, would encourage you to go back and listen to that. It's related to our topic today, but we thought because of the significance of this week in the United States, and interestingly enough, actually in Canada as well, and in the United Kingdom, we thought we really do need to do an Independence Day special for it's July 4th, of course, on Thursday. And on Thursday in the United Kingdom, we have a general election, which is falling on Independence Day. And of course, just a couple of days ago, it was Canada Dominion Day on the 1st of July. So basically, this week, we've had Canada Dominion Day. We've got the general election in the United Kingdom, and it's Independence Day. So and those are the three territories where most of our listeners are. We have listeners scattered all around the world, actually, Dan, but the biggest concentrations are in the United States, Canada, and the UK, and it's a significant week for all of those countries. So we thought we would address this topic today of Independence Day and the political character of the West, especially in view of the UK election and Canada Dominion Day. And I know we've got a lot of territory to cover, but Dan, welcome to the show. Why don't we start by talking just a little bit about Independence Day and its meaning and its significance, especially in relationship to the then existing and current relationship between our two countries, down the United Kingdom and the United States. In modern political parlance, I guess from the 20th century on, the special relationship that has existed for generations between cousins, Great Britain and the United States of America. We had a little bit of a spat there, a sort of a lover's spat, as it were, a bit of a family breakdown. But the relationship has remained very close for all kinds of constitutional reasons. We sometimes call it, don't we, the Anglosphere. And it's Independence Day on Thursday. So tell us a bit about that and talk to us about what are the historical roots of this special relationship as well.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me on the podcast again. It's great to be on. Yeah, this is, for me personally, this is always outside of Easter and Christmas. It's my favorite time of the year. I absolutely love the story of U.S. independence, our founders, how all that came about. It is interesting that we have a Brit and American, Englishman and American on this show talking. 240 years ago, perhaps we may not have been. But of course, it is interesting just to note that both of our intellectual heroes, Edmund Burke, actually was a supporter of the colonies. And one of the issues that we'll get into, talk about later, but one of the main reasons for perhaps the primary reason that the colonists felt they needed to make a break for Great Britain is because their rights as Englishmen were being violated by Parliament. And this phrase, no taxation without representation, uh, what the Parliament said as well as the King. And of course, we're talking about George III here, one of the worst monarchs in English history. The King represents you, and the colonists said no, we should be represented in Parliament. We're not. We don't get any rights to vote. Therefore, no taxation without representation. It's interesting. Now today, July 2nd, actually was the day that many of our founders thought would be celebrated as Independence Day, because that was actually the day that the resolution on independence was adopted. But July 4th is when the entire Declaration of Independence as a complete body was adopted. So that turned out to be the day we celebrate independence. But yeah, it is interesting relationship of U.S. and U.K. You mentioned as cousins. I kind of also, we often call Britain or England the mother country. And I think it's kind of like, at least the admonition, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother. We'll just leave it there. In this sense, the United States kind of left its mother and it grew up. And I actually think there's a strong argument that can be made that actually was better for both countries, both the US and the UK, that this split occurred. because I think it enabled the United States to develop in a way independently that may not have been possible. For example, the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, I don't know that that would ever happened if it had been British colonies still. And so the whole ability of the United States to become the country it is today, and of course, we helped to save Great Britain in both world wars, particularly the Second World War, which First World War, Britain was doing okay for the most part without us. But particularly the Second World War, when Britain stood alone against Hitler, the United States, at least initially, provided the Lend-Lease program through naval vessels for Great Britain, and eventually, of course, D-Day, which we just had by the way, the 80th anniversary. So I think both countries were actually better off. Now, one other thing too, just real quickly about, we often hear the term the American Revolution, but in many ways, it wasn't so much a revolution. It really was a secession movement of the colonies. And of course, when we contrast the American quote unquote revolution, the French Revolution, to two radically different forms of activity, the American Revolution did not seek to upend the political social order. It sought to restore rights. And the colonists appealed to the king one final time before they decided to work for independence. They said, Parliament is taking away our rights as Englishmen. We appeal to you, and basically King George said, stick it, shove it. So at that point, then the colonists realized that there wasn't any choice but to declare independence. But it wasn't a movement to create a social upheaval like the French Revolution was. So um, the bottom line is this: I think the United States and the UK have benefited from this break, and I think both countries, we do have the special relationship. And myself, as an American, I look back to the history of British kings. Two of my heroes are Henry V and Elizabeth the Great, and I see that as part of my heritage as an American.
Yeah, well, yes, the Anglo historians and sociologists talk about the Anglo-American tradition and the shared history. And the Canadians who are listening, of course, yesterday Canada Dominion Day, no independence movement there. That the pressures were different. They weren't the same kind of pressures, and so the king, the monarch, is still the head of state in Canada, part of the British Commonwealth. But I totally agree that it was in the providence of God and the mercy of God and the goodness of God that the colonies went their separate ways. And God raised up the United States, especially throughout the 20th century, for his purposes. And it's often overlooked, as you mentioned, that Edmund Burke and of course men like William Wilberforce and many parliamentarians were for and promoted the independence of the colonies, and they were against any military action to suppress the colonists' desire for independence. I think the tax actually concerned, Dan, was stamp duty. And ironically, we are today persecuted in Britain with stamp duty whenever we sell or purchase a home. In the United Kingdom, it's an iniquitous tax. The stamp duty. Successive governments have often promised to either eliminate it or reduce it or whatever. But it's a terrible tax. And I'm not at all surprised that the colonists were sick and tired of paying taxes without being properly represented. Now, that brings me to something else, Dan, that we can move on to from our own after that excellent and helpful introduction. And that is to begin to talk a bit about the nature of legitimate government. Some pretty bizarre things are said and confused things are said about this in the United States. Here's a little insight right now. We're going to play you a clip of one bit of opinion about where rights actually come from. Listen to this.
You're going to hear words like Christian nationalism, like the New Apostolic Reformation. These are groups that you should get very very schooled on, because they have a lot of power in Trump's circle. And the one thing that unites all of them, because there's many different groups orbiting Trump, but the thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not Christians, by the way, because Christian nationalist is very different, is that they believe that our rights as Americans, as all human beings, don't come from any earthly authority. They don't come from Congress. They don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God.
Okay, well, there you have it. Fascinating stuff. Terrifying thought that our rights actually might come from God. Dan, there might be a law above the law. I want to, towards the end of our program today, come to one of the problems in the Western context, and I think it's true in America, not just in Britain and Canada, but there in the UK. I am very familiar with, having lived in North America for many years and spending a lot of my time in the United States, even today, but living in the United Kingdom, and the work of Ezra being in Canada, the US, and in the UK, of the ignorance there is about the nature of US politics. The total ignorance about the nature of the US Constitution and the nonsense that people spout about it. And doesn't appear just to be a problem outside of the US in the UK and Canada. You actually hear that sort of twaddle from American media. So, Dan, why don't you just talk to us a minute about the concept of law and the rule of law as it's related to U.S. constitutional issues, because this is so critically important. Of course, the whole idea comes out of Scripture and it comes through the English tradition. But talk to us about that.
Yeah, one of the reasons I even suggested doing this podcast with you is the excellent podcast you all did last week. And Michael mentioned at one point the notion of rule of law. I know last week you all didn't have time to get into that, but I thought we should spend a few minutes talking about the importance of that concept and how it relates to the political order in the United States. We have this term that Samuel Rutherford, I believe, is one of the ones that perhaps first mentioned it, but the question is lex rex or is rex lex? In other words, lex being law, rex being the king. Is the law the king or is the king the law? Now, this concept of the rule of law actually basically originates from biblical principles. If we look at Old Testament Israel, we see that God was the lawgiver, and therefore his law was divine. But if we look at historically at pagan empires, the rulers consider themselves to be quite often divine. Of course, we have Caesar in Rome, starting with Augustus Caesar. He actually was considered to be divine. We have the emperor, the ruler of Persia. One of my favorite movies, and I think probably for you as well, Joe, is the movie 300, where the Greeks are holding off the Persians, the battle, and Darius comes up, and the way he's portrayed in the movie is this rather large guy, and he says, "Who are you to resist your God?" And so the reason that these rulers consider themselves to be divine, for a lot of reasons. One reason was, therefore, they were above the law, because if you're divine and you're the one giving the law, then the law has no restriction on you and what you can do. And of course, we see this in modern times as well. Now Xi Jinping of China kind of considers himself to be the son of heaven, as the traditionally Chinese emperors were. But it's not just in individuals today. It really has to do with the party or the state. And for example, the Soviet Union, the party was basically the ruling force, and the party is considered to be infallible. Therefore, what the party says is law. Therefore, the party and the state as well. And so, and it's even interesting. I saw just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, I was reading about the French elections. That's also going on right now. Quite interesting. And it made a reference to Macron, and where Macron said his office was that of Jupiter. In other words, his office was basically, the god. So if a ruler or a party, the state, is considered to be divine, or at least has this notion of infallibility, then basically that it can do no wrong and it's not subject to law. And of course, this is utterly different than we saw in Again, in Israel, in biblical Israel, where the kings were subject to the law, David said, I love the law and meditate on it both day and night. And whenever the kings of Israel violated that law and actually considered themselves to be have this infallibility, that's of course when we saw Israel suffered. So this is a very important concept. And one thing I want to mention is we can talk about this next is kind of the relationship between the rule of law and the Constitution. But I'll throw it back to you for a moment.
Yeah, I think that that critical distinction you made there, essentially between the pagan view and the biblical view, is vital. It's the law of the Medes and the Persians, as it were, which is unbreakable divine law. It's one of the reasons why Darius wasn't able to go back on his edict with respect to Daniel, because a God just spoke and it's irrevocable. And so this whole idea, and as you say, it's come through to us in contemporary times in the form of statism, expressed so powerfully in the Soviet Union with the infallibility of the Communist Party. It was also there, of course, in National Socialism and in fascism in Italy and Germany in the 20th century, a similar kind of idea. It was expressed actually more recently in more sort of democratic terms by Michael Ignatieff some years ago after the attacks on September 11th. He was critiquing the American government. He's a Harvard professor. He was leader of the Liberal Party in Canada for some time. And he talked about the modern concept of the state as being the object of ultimate allegiance. And this is a quote: the object of ultimate allegiance and the source of law. Not the body that positivizes law, but the source of law itself and the object of ultimate allegiance. Now, that's very much a pagan concept. And as you say, this is what the Western tradition broke with. And of course, that was expressed in the English Revolution, which we haven't talked about. It predates, of course, the American Revolution, but the English Revolution, where there was the concern to make sure that the absolute power claims of the king to being basically the divine representative was broken. And so biblical law actually requires that the king make a copy of the law of God. The king makes a copy of the law of God himself and reads it every day, expressly so that he's not lifted up above his people. What an absolutely incredible difference there between the pagan idea of authority and political authority and God's idea. Let's just move on a little bit. You talked a bit about the biblical principles. Let's talk a little bit about then constitutionalism. And here's a slight difference of expression in the way it's worked out in the United States over against the United Kingdom. We in Britain, like ancient Israel, have an unwritten constitution. It's a common law tradition. It sort of builds and grows through precedent, through applications of biblical law to concrete situations. In the US, of course, the background of the US Constitution is and the Bill of Rights is the biblical law, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and so on. So the background is there. It's expressed slightly differently constitutionally. But talk to us a little bit, Dan, about the way in which the written document of the U.S. Constitution, why it's important, how it's informed by the English Constitution, and what are the most significant things about that we might say that it embodies about creational rights, about pre-political rights that are important for people to understand.
Yeah, so the rule of law, I think, is best effectuated when you have a constitution. Now, as you mentioned, for example, biblical Israel had a constitution. It consisted of obviously the Decalogue, but a lot other points that were included. So there wasn't necessarily just a written document that says this is Constitution. Same thing happened in Great Britain, obviously, but in the United States, it was deemed important that we actually have a written document. But I think one of the essence of biblical principles is this essence of constitutionalism, because what a constitution does, it sets out the powers of government and the limits of the powers of government, as well as the rights that the citizens within that country have. So let me just talk a little bit about the U.S. Constitution and also its relationship to the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I'll talk a little more in a few minutes about the biblical foundations of the Declaration itself, because there actually are 4 references to God that they're quite interesting. But in the United States, we have, well, let me just mention this about constitutions in general. Many countries have had constitutions. The Soviet Union had a constitution, and on paper, it looked like it was a great document. But of course, obviously, it was a superfluous document. But what's really critical is a recognition of where the power and authority of the state comes from, as well as the rights of individuals. And I have used this term creational rights, which is really a takeoff of what John Locke and others have called natural rights. Now, I know that Ezra's had a lot of discussion about natural law. It's an interesting concept, and natural law actually means different things to different people, but primarily those who believe in natural law, either they think it's law that's divine, that comes from God, or it comes from reason. I would argue that in the American tradition, it is natural law is seen in the both in the time of our founding as well as current times as being actually divine law. So you can have a constitution, you can have all these rights and limitations upon government, but if the idea of rights as rights that come from the state, what the state giveth, the state can taketh away. And therefore, I think if you're truly going to have an effectual rule of law, not only do you need to have a constitution, but you also have to have a recognition that rights do not come from the state. They do not come from the party. They do not come from a ruler. Rather, they come from another source. And of course, we know that source is God. Now, it's interesting. Years ago, I had a brief discussion with one of our colleagues, Dr. Peter Jones, about the rights in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, or stated life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And he said, well, is there really a biblical foundation for that? And I've thought about that over the years, and I've come to realize, yes, in fact, there is. Now, let me give an example. Let's say, Joe, that you decide that you want to change careers. You no longer want to be the head of Ezra, rather you want to become a house painter. And so you and I enter into a contract for you to paint my house. And you are under that contract, you are obligated to paint my house, but also you have a right to be paid for me or by me for painting my house. The same way is, from my standpoint, I would have an obligation to pay you for painting my house, but then I would have a right for my house to be painted by you. So the whole principle is that whenever you see an obligation, there also is a corresponding right. Now, I know over the years, many people have said correctly, well, as Christians, we don't have any rights as relates to God. And that's correct in our vertical relationship, because we know that Scripture says that God is no man's debtor. So God is not obligated to us. So this principle of rights and obligation doesn't apply in our vertical relationship with the Lord, but it does apply in our horizontal relationships. And so if we go to the Decalogue, for example, thou shalt not murder. If I am obligated not to murder someone, that means that person has a corresponding right not to be murdered, in other words, right to life. Now, of course, the right to life is given to us by God, but also that person also, not only do they have a right that comes from God to right to life, but they also have a right not to be murdered, because there's an obligation of me not to murder them. Same thing, that thou shalt not steal. In other words, I have an obligation not to engage in theft. That means that other theft of someone's property, that means they have a right to property. And so if you look at the rights that are specified in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was basically considered to be the right to property. They changed the wording But actually, these are life, liberty, and property. These rights were enunciated by John Locke in his two treatises of government. We also see these specific rights in the U.S. Constitution, both the 5th and 14th Amendment, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. These rights, we see that actually not only do we affirm that they come from God, but there actually is a biblical foundation for them. And I also should mention, by the way, in the Declaration of Independence, it does say that man is endowed by his Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these being life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which tells you that those aren't the only rights, because the phrasing "among these" means that these are not the only exclusive rights, but their rights, life, liberty, and property, are all very essential to living in a free society, and our founders recognize that. And also in the U.S. Constitution, just to kind of tie that to the U.S. Constitution, we do have this thing called the Bill of Rights. Now, it's interesting that actually among the many of our framers of the Constitution who were at the Constitutional Convention in 1786, they didn't see the necessity for a Bill of Rights. Not that they didn't think that there weren't any rights, because that's, after all, was really the foundation of the American Revolution, but rather it had to do with relation between the states and the newly created federal government. The U.S. federal government is the creation of the states, and therefore the only powers that the U.S. federal government has are those powers that explicitly provide for in the Constitution. Therefore, how is it the federal government, this is the way the argument went, how is it the federal government would have a right to restrict the freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion when it wasn't given those rights by the state? The other reason that many of the founders were against the Bill of Rights is they thought, if we specify what these specific rights are, is that a statement that these are the only rights? Well, it turns out that the what are called the anti-federalist, it turns out that they were pushing for a Bill of Rights because their argument was, look, we understand what you're arguing, but nevertheless, if we don't have it specified in the document, who knows what may happen. And so the promise to have a Bill of Rights was made in order to get the number of states to ratify the Constitution. But so for those who might argue, well, the U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment, says Congress shall not abridge the freedom of speech, shall not free exercise religion, etc. Isn't that saying that the state is giving those rights originating from the state? And that would be a mistake to think that. Rather than the Bill of Rights rather than those rights originating from the state, it's merely a recognition those rights exist in the first place. And I think if you look as proof of this reading, if you look at the Ninth Amendment, it said there's also other rights that are not mentioned here. Well, if there's other rights that aren't mentioned here in the Bill of Rights, where do those rights come from? So if you tie the Declaration, which is an explicit recognition that these rights come from God, if you tie that to the Constitution, I think the sounder argument to make is that the Constitution does not invent these rights. It's not that the state, like in the Soviet Union, said you have these rights. Rather, the Constitution recognizes that these rights exist. And so in order to really have an effective rule of law in the country, you need a Constitution, but you also need a recognition of rights that come from God and that do not come from the state.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said there about life, liberty, and property, basically, the pursuit of happiness, basically the freedom to pursue and acquire and maintain your property in peace. I think it's important to note that is the root and ground of American prosperity. If you do not have security for a guarantee for that you will not be deprived of your life, your liberty, or your property without the due process of law, then why would you invest? Why would you build a home? Why would you create a business? This is the problem that so many people don't see, and this is why in socialistic states, in neo-Marxist states today, the reason why, poverty stalks socialism, and we'll come to this a bit later on in our discussion today, but where there is a threat, where there is an existential threat to your property, possessing your property in peace, which you cannot be deprived of it without due process of law, people naturally will not take the risk in those environments. Of course, if you don't have the guarantee of the you shall not steal, basically, as you said, if that's not recognized in the law, in the Constitution, then it's almost impossible for that nation to grow prosperous, because the state can simply, or political actors can seize those assets at will. You see it on a smaller scale with the reservation system in Canada, where you can't freely trade. People can't freely trade property. You have poverty. But you're not going to have free trade, and you're not going to have free and just markets if you do not have this guarantee that life and your liberty and your property are protected, and you can't be deprived of them without the due process of law. Without that, you've got tyranny. And that is, people look at the United States of America in the 20th century, before it became quite so debt laden and moving away from its core values and principles, and the explosion of wealth, of prosperity. I mean, it's how the United States, replaced Britain as the superpower essentially in the world, the great power in the world. Also, the US dollar became the benchmark for global currency. This is the product of freedom and liberty and the protection of property rights. That is absolutely critical to understanding you can comment on that in a moment, Dan, if you want to, but in my judgment, that's one of the core reasons for American prosperity that was the envy of the world. When we talk about these creational rights, and you've talked about them being rooted in God, there is this idea of American exceptionalism. There is this idea of unique features of the U.S. Declaration of Independence that talks about God being the creator, God being the supreme judge, and how vital these are actually to freedom and prosperity and so on. Now, of course, as a Brit and Canadian, I'm a dual citizen. We would say, well, there's a kind of British exceptionalism too. We've enjoyed these God-given freedoms and rights under a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to being technically a republic. Of course, res publica just means that the state is a truly public thing rather than a private thing. So instead of barons and lords having their own private law over given areas, there is truly a nation state where the law is public, and that's of course true in Canada and in the United Kingdom. But this whole question, I mean, you saw it, Dan. I think actually you and I were in Texas together watching the coronation of King Charles I, because I was speaking in the US at the time. I was on a bit of a tour in Texas, and we were together for part of that. And we talked about the distinctly Christian symbolism of that coronation, the explicitness of the lordship of Jesus Christ and his kingship over Britain, over the monarch, over Parliament, and so on. Some of the critics of the U.S. Constitution, Christian critics, might say, well, yes, definitely the U.S. Constitution is grounded in biblical commitments. Maybe a slight improvement could have been that this was explicitly a subjection to the lordship of Jesus Christ, as we have in the coronation oath in the British situation. But let's face it, whichever system you're looking at, neither system is an ironclad protection against radical secularization, radical democratization and the slipping away of our nations from God. I forget to who it was now, Dan, you will know, that said, the American Constitution was written for religious people, meaning a Christian people. And if that erodes, yes, Adams. If that erodes, then we've got problems. Well, the same is true in the English Constitution. We have a king who's the titular head of the Church of England. But if that church goes apostate and the king loses his grip on orthodox biblical faith, fails to read the law, fails to hold a parliament to account, and Parliament, loses its sense of its commitment to God in the solemn league and covenant that Parliament signed, even Charles II signed in England in the 17th century, committing itself to serve the Lord Jesus Christ and His word and the gospel. That no constitutional arrangement will save us. Not the British Constitution, not the American Constitution. It cannot save us. Only Christ can save. We can do what we can constitutionally. You can put protections in. You can, as was the idea of the framers, you can restrain sin by a division of powers. You can recognize the fallenness of man by recognizing God as supreme judge and creator, but you can't guarantee the future of any nation that turns against God. So with those caveats in place, tell us a little bit about this unique feature of the American independence, the document, this recognition of God as creator and supreme judge. And then let's conclude a bit by talking about the nature of constitutionalism as a bulwark against this kind of radical democracy, radical democratization. We've got in the US, we've got originalists who, like you, who recognize what the intent of the framers were, but we also have these revisionists who are intent on, turning the US Constitution upside down and making it mean something altogether different. So let's talk about God as supreme judge, and creator and supreme judge, and the significance of that and the Constitution there in resisting these ideas, these French ideas, really, of pure democracy and a sort of socialistic totalitarianism.
Yes, the evil French. Although I will give France credit, without French help, the United States wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War. But anyway, it's French. It's the ancient regime was good. I mean, differences, but it's the Robespierre and the Jacobins that we have the blame for these issues in the world today. Okay, so a few words about, first of all, there's a lot of controversy over whether American has a quote-unquote Christian founding. It's way too long a subject to get into in depth today. But I think if you look at the Declaration, I think there is a biblical foundation. Now, first of all, there were 5 members who were on the Declaration Committee, and not all of them were believers as we would define that term today. In fact, among our founders, not all of them were what we would call evangelical Christians, but the ones that I think were really significant were Adams, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. 2 others on that committee were Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. Roger Sherman was a dying will Calvinist, without question, a believer. Franklin probably was the least among, I think it'd be probably accurate to call him a deist. Jefferson's quite often referred to as a deist, but I think that's a mistake. I think Jefferson was a Unitarian because he believed that God was actually active. Let me just read you one quote of Jefferson's. He says, this is a quote, "God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." So Jefferson certainly believed, as did Adams and obviously Roger Sherman, and I would say all the founders, even Franklin, that God was active in the affairs of men. Doesn't mean that they all were believers as we would define them. But another thing about the Declaration and the Constitution relation, I like to say that the Declaration is, let's consider this in the context of corporation. The Declaration is like the Articles of Incorporation. It kind of tells you why does this corporation exist. And then the Constitution is like the operating bylaws. How do we go about doing all these things? So the fact that the Constitution itself does not mention God is true. There's no mention of God in it, but the Constitution, without question, incorporates the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Without the Declaration, there would be no Constitution. So now, in reference to what I would call the biblical foundation for the Declaration, there are actually 4 places in the Declaration where God is mentioned in some form. Now, sometimes the left and progressives and Marxists will say, well, they just use these, like the term creator as a euphemism. But I would disagree. It wasn't just a euphemism. It also wasn't like a substitute for reason. Again, these founders actually believe that God was active. So there's 4 instances just real quick in the Declaration. First, it talks about the laws of nature and nature's God. Well, that makes it clear that God is actually the authors of the law of nature, meaning these laws of nature are in fact his laws. So it isn't just natural law, meaning like this Greek concept of reason. Actually, it talks about nature's God. So God is the one who makes his laws. That's number one. Of course, probably the phrase that's most recognizable is all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. That makes it clear. The Declaration affirms that God is not only the creator of mankind, and that's a very important distinction. We don't live in, as Peter Jones would say, in a onist world where creation and creation are all the same. It's to us. And so the Declaration of Independence, in Peter's words, is actually very much a to-us document. So this affirms that, again, that God is not only the creator of mankind, but that rights come from him and not from the state. The third phrase, later on in the Declaration, it says, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. Now, that is a critically important statement because this recognizes that God is the judge of nations and thereby is A, the lawgiver, and B, the ruler of nations. I mean, you would never use a phrase, the supreme judge. What does it mean, the supreme judge? Just that term itself recognizes the position that God has, that nations, while they are in a horizontal relationship with each other, just like humans are, it's a vertical relationship with God. So God is the ruler of nations. And of course, your excellent book that you wrote a couple years ago makes this very clear. And then finally, there's one final phrase where it says, a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Now, I mean, again, this isn't just surplusage. This isn't just a euphemism. Here, the United States and the Declaration of Independence recognizes that God is indeed sovereign in the affairs of men, and it relies upon that sovereignty, relying upon it to effectuate the ends of the Declaration, which was the independence of the United States. So it's very clear that while the Constitution doesn't have a reference to God, the Constitution is inexorably tied to the Declaration, and the Declaration makes it very clear that our founders believe that there is a God. He's a ruler of nations. He's a creator. He's the one that provides the rights to mankind, and he's sovereign, and we're going to rely upon his sovereignty to bring about what we set out to accomplish to do.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, look, let's just let's wrap this up by landing the plane a little bit in these last few minutes by talking just a little bit about this this bulwark that the Constitution was meant to create, and of course, here in the United Kingdom, we're facing similar difficulties. That despite being a constitutional monarchy, there's this perpetual drift towards social democracy, direct democracy, this sort of Rousseau European style, equalitarian, egalitarian, equality, fraternity, equality, and so on. This sort of much more revolutionary understanding that was not part of the US understanding of democracy, which is, as we said in the podcast last week, about it is a mechanism for electing our leaders. The US is a constitutional republic. It is not a radical, pure democracy. And what we're seeing in the United Kingdom is we've seen this perpetual pull towards European-style social democracy. where we're losing our sense of our identity, our understanding of government, of the relationship of the state to the people as a covenant under God. The meaning of the coronation oath is basically covenantal. And Parliament's responsibility, both to God and the people, covenantal. Same with the US. There's this kind of covenantal understanding. It's not simply a social contract. When you refer to God, His providence, the Creator, His law, His judgment, as we've just heard in the Declaration of Independence, then we're actually talking about a covenantal understanding of our responsibilities towards God and to one another. But we've had this sort of this drag ever since the French Revolution towards more radical notions of democracy, Dan. If you look at, and I'd like you to comment on this because, I come across Christians in the UK all of the time who, especially when you look at the US politics today, and they think that the Democrat Party is the safe pair of hands. It's the sort of party of a sort of centrist party of stability and reason. And of course, you've got the hysteria about the Republican Party right now that you pick up in Europe and Canada and in Britain. But just talk to us a little bit about the bulwark against pure democracy. We've got about 5 minutes left, so and this sort of perpetual drift towards social democracy. This idea of pure democracy, of basically socialism, over against a democratic republic, and help our international listeners to understand what the two parties right now in America really represent in terms of these positions.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier, I'm an originalist, and that's correct. Originalists believe the Constitution means something. Words have meaning. One of my favorite, who now is deceased, economist, Dr. Walter Williams, always used to say, if you believe that the Constitution is of the view of people like William Brennan and others, that the Constitution, what the Supreme Court says it is, he said, think about we're playing poker and we're into the game, and all of a sudden I change the rules in the middle of the game. That's what those who believe in the so-called living Constitution basically espouse, is that the Constitution is what the court says it is, and it is interesting that the Democrat Party tends to they as Mark Levin will always say, they always tend to laud the Constitution, what's in favor of them politically. But then again, when we had this incredibly monumental Supreme Court decision yesterday regarding presidential immunity, and by the way, just for our Canadian and British listeners, as well as Americans, this is being hailed as a victory for Donald Trump. Well, in current politics, that's probably true. But it's much more, as Mark Levin says, as a victory for the Constitution, because what the Supreme Court did in this case, basically to say, is separation of powers means something. And therefore, the President of the United States cannot just be politically prosecuted just because perhaps he makes a decision that another party doesn't like. For example, Trump ordered the execution, basically, of Soleimani in Iran a few years ago, and many were calling for charges to be brought up for the ICC for a war crime doing that. Well, under international law, the United States had every right to do that. But think about Biden himself. I mean, the argument is, well, without presidential immunity, Biden could actually be prosecuted, whether he wins re-election or not, for certain things that perhaps occurred during his presidency. So there is a fundamentally different view of the role of the Constitution, where it's the Constitution says what it says that it says, versus the Constitution is what some governmental body says that it is. And so when you look at this in relation then to current U.S. politics, I think, if you look at the push for, sexuality issues, gender issues, student loan payments, Biden has defied Supreme Court decisions. We also have this very important decision last week, the overruled the Chevron doctrine, which really cuts back in the power of the bureaucratic state. It's very clear that the two parties have different philosophical positions in regard to what does the U.S. Constitution mean. And again, the Republican position would be more that it is a bulwark against government overreach, whereas we have the bureaucratic state. And when we think about this from the whole Kuyperian notion of spheres of sovereignty, yes, sphere sovereignty, we have an interference in these business sphere with the government with all these overbearing, unnecessary regulations. And so the Republican Party tends to be, we want the government to stick to the powers that it has under the Constitution, but no more, where the Democrat Party tends to say, we are going to expand the government and the Constitution be damned. If we'll try to argue the Constitution supports this, but even if it doesn't, we don't care. And that's, I think, is a philosophical difference between the two parties. Now, this is not an endorsement on this program of one party versus the other. But I think if we look at an honest, objective viewpoint, there is a big difference between originalists who believe that the Constitution means what it says versus the advocates of the living Constitution, where we'll go ahead and do all these, as you say, leftist, neo-Marxist things, and we'll try to couch us, oh yeah, the Constitution supports us, but if it doesn't, we don't care.
Yeah. So would you say one of the fundamental issues today, whenever we think about voting, whenever we think about elections, whenever we're analyzing political parties and so on, that whether you're in the States or Canada or the United Kingdom as the elections this week, we should be thinking about the size of the state. I mean, social democracy, radical democracy is all about the expansion of the state. It treats all the other aspects of society and of societal government, the family, the church, business, the economy, media, everything else, as merely lesser parts of itself. That sort of unrestrained growth of the state is the sort of fundamental hallmark of this European-style social democracy, whereas it seems to me that the framers and the founders of the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were concerned with limited government, with accountable government, and with separation of powers, with small government. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. The thing that the founders feared the most was tyranny. And they saw the separation of powers, three distinct branches, executive, legislative, judicial. They saw that as important. And not only did they give each of those in the Constitution, those branches, powers, but also actually had them compete against each other. Because, in other words, there are some areas we could say is somewhat shared. And so you have the competing. And we don't have time to get into this, but I think, as you mentioned last week, the whole concept of separation of powers about executive, legislative, and judicial is very much also a biblical concept. David said in one of his Psalms, you're my executive, you're my legislator, and you're my judge. And that's very much, and so not only is it a biblical concept, but it's also a very practical concept because it by having separation of powers, you're prohibiting tyranny ultimately. Now, there's no guarantee. We know that. It's not a guarantee. We can only do the best we can. We live in an imperfect world. We live with imperfect people. But we can only do the best we can. But at least separation of powers. And that's a very critical part of the Constitution and is considered a bulwark by the founders against tyranny.
Dan, this has been great. I wish we had longer. We're just coming up on the hour. We'll have to have you back on again a bit later in the year as all these political things unfold in the UK and France, and then, of course, in the autumn, in the fall, in the United States. And we'll be able to talk a bit more about the Lordship of Christ, biblical worldview, and its relationship to politics and government. So, Dan, thank you very much for joining us. And all that remains for me is to say to our listeners, to remind you once again that from him and through him and to him are all things. To God be the glory. We'll speak to you again next week.